The dream came again, the way it always did, not with images but with weight. Torvald Dreth woke in his chamber on the 47th floor of the Conclave Archive, his four-fingered hands gripping the writing tablet hard enough to crack its casing. The stylus had rolled to the floor and lay against the baseboard like a bone someone had dropped. The last line he had written before sleep took him was still glowing on the tablet's surface, pale blue against black, and he read it with the slow horror of a man reading his own autopsy. The line was not his. He had not composed it. He had not thought it. The syntax was wrong, not wrong in the way a tired writer makes errors, but wrong in the way a foreign language is wrong when it wears the mask of your own. The grammar was perfect velour, every conjugation precise, every tonal marker in place, every breath pause notation set exactly where a velour reader would expect to find it. But the rhythm underneath was something else, something older, something that moved like deep water under ice, following currents no surface wind had set in motion. He deleted the line. His hands were shaking. Outside his window, the capital spires of Valor Prime caught the first gray light of the binary dawn, and the city hummed with the low-frequency vibration of 11 billion lives pressed into a civilization that had endured for 9,000 years. Torvald had lived here for the last 47 of those years, ever since the Conclave had brought him back from the border, ever since the poems had started. He was 106 years old, which meant he was dying. The Valori lived to 120 on average, sometimes 130 if the gene markers were favorable, and his were not. His physician had told him 18 months ago that the cellular architecture of his lungs was collapsing, a slow, quiet failure that would give him perhaps 2 years if he rested, less if he continued to write through the night as he had done every night for 4.5 decades. He continued to write through the night. That was the part that frightened the Conclave. Not that he was dying, everyone died, but that he could not stop. 47 years of poems, essays, fragments, testimonials, all of them published under his name, all of them celebrated as the finest literary work the Valori civilization had produced in a millennium. Torvald Dreth, the poet of the border, the voice of the silence, winner of the Conclave's highest cultural honor 11 times, more than any writer in recorded history. And none of the words were his. That was what the dream always told him, in its wordless, heavy way. That was the weight that pressed him flat against the sleeping mat every night and held him there, while the thing inside him finished writing whatever it intended to write. The dream was not a vision. It was a reckoning. It arrived each night like a tide, and like a tide it carried things up from the depths, not images, not memories, but the raw, unprocessed shape of a guilt so fundamental it had become the architecture of his sleep. He picked up the stylus, turned the tablet over in his hands. The casing was warm from the hours it had spent pressed against his chest while he slept, as if the device itself had absorbed something from the act of lying so close to the source. The Conclave's morning bell sounded through the archive, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through 47 floors of stone and pressurized atmosphere. Torvald set the tablet on the desk and began his ritual, the slow, careful movements of a body that no longer did what it was told without negotiation. The right knee that locked unless he straightened it in stages, the left hand that trembled until the circulation warmed it, the lungs that rattled with each deep breath, a wet, crackling sound that reminded him of the noise old data crystals made when their lattice structures began to fracture. He was falling apart. The thing inside him was not. He had tried to explain it once, 31 years ago, to archivist Solon Mach. Solon had been his editor for the first 16 years, a meticulous, humorless woman whose species, the Gravathi, had evolved on a high-gravity moon, and who edited manuscripts the way a surgeon removes shrapnel. Quickly, without sentiment, with absolute certainty about what belonged and what did not. The Gravathi were short, dense, built for pressure. Their bones were nearly 3 times the density of a Valori's, their skin thick and gray and faintly metallic, their eyes small and deeply recessed under ridges of protective cartilage. Solon moved through the world like something bolted to it. She had shaped Torvald's first 3 collections into the work that made his reputation. She had also been the first person to notice that something was wrong. "The new sequence," she had said, laying the manuscript on the desk between them with the care of someone handling a venomous specimen. "Read the 4th stanza aloud." He had read it. The words had come easily, they always came easily. That was the problem, and as he spoke them he heard what she heard. The stanza was about the border. Not the political border between Valori space and the next jurisdiction, but the other border. The one that did not appear on official charts. The one that the Conclave's navigation authority had marked with a single glyph that translated, roughly, as "do not." The stanza described the texture of the silence beyond that border. Not silence as absence of sound, but silence as presence, as substance, as architecture, as something that had been built with intention and maintained with care by hands that did not operate at the scale of individual species or individual centuries. The stanza described the way the silence changed when you approached it, how it thickened, how it acquired direction, a specificity, as if it were not merely existing in front of you but looking at you. The stanza described the moment of recognition, the instant when the traveler understands that the silence is not a wall but a lens, and that the lens is focused inward. Solon had listened to him read, and then she had closed the manuscript. "Who wrote that, Torvald?" "I did." "No, you did not." She had leaned forward, her dense frame settling into the chair like a stone into mud, the reinforced furniture creaking under weight that would have been unremarkable on her homeworld. "I have edited your work for 16 years. I know your cadence the way a musician knows a tuning fork. The first 3 stanzas are yours, the syntax, the breath marks, the way you nest subordinate clauses inside each other like nesting dolls, the way you use the Valori diminutive suffix to express tenderness rather than smallness. But the 4th stanza is not yours. It is wearing your language, but it is not thinking in your language. It is thinking in something else and translating, and the translation is almost perfect. Almost. There is a residue. A faint wrongness in the pacing, as if the thoughts originated at a different speed and were slowed down to fit our syllable structure. He had not argued. There was no point. She was right and he was tired of pretending. "It happens at night," he had said. "I fall asleep at the desk, and when I wake there are new lines on the tablet. Sometimes a stanza, sometimes a full sequence, sometimes a single word that rearranges the poem around it like a keystone rearranges an arch. I do not remember writing them. I do not remember dreaming them. But they are in my handwriting, in my language, and they are about the border." "Since when?" "Since I came back." Solon had been quiet for a long time. The Gravathi did not do long silences. Their culture was direct, functional, built on the assumption that information withheld was energy wasted. But she had sat in that chair and looked at him with her small, deep-set eyes, and he had seen something in her expression that he had never seen from a Gravathi before. Not fear, grief. The anticipatory grief of someone who understands that a relationship has just been fundamentally altered by a fact that cannot be unlearned. 16 years, Torvald. You have been carrying this for 16 years and you did not tell me. I did not know how. You are a poet. Finding the words is your only function. The words are the problem, Solon. That is what I am telling you. The words are not mine. She had looked at the manuscript on the desk between them. 31 poems, 412 stanzas, perhaps 9,000 lines of verse, each one praised by the Conclave's literary establishment as the most significant contribution to Valori culture in living memory. She had edited every line. She had shaped every collection. She had sat with Torvald through 18-hour revision sessions, arguing about individual syllables, and she had believed, they had both believed, that the words emerging from those sessions were the product of a single, exceptional mind. "How much?" she had asked. I do not understand the question. How much of it is not yours? The fourth stanza of the new sequence that I can hear, but how far back does it go? The third collection, the second, the first. He had not answered. The answer was all of it, and he could not say that to the woman who had built her professional identity on the belief that she was editing the work of a genius. She had heard his silence. She had read it the way she read manuscripts precisely, without sentiment. She had stood, collected the manuscript, and walked to the door. I will finish the edit, she had said. This collection will be published. It is extraordinary work regardless of its source, but I will not edit the next one. She had kept her word. The collection had been published. She had retired 3 months later. They had not spoken again. That conversation was the first crack in the architecture of the guilt. Not because Solon had judged him, she had not really, but because she had named what he was: a carrier, a vessel, a channel through which something vast and old was speaking in the only language the galaxy could hear. 47 years counted backward. The structure of his life made more sense in reverse, each layer peeling away to reveal the one beneath. The way sediment reveals geological history when you cut straight down. At year 47, this morning, this dawn, this cracked tablet and this line that was not his Torvan was the most celebrated writer the Velori had produced. His work was taught in every academy on the homeworld. His poems were carved into the walls of the new conclave chambers, where the assembly met to deliberate the fate of 9 billion citizens and 16 affiliated species. His essays on the nature of silence had been translated into 31 languages, and were studied by scholars across 4 stellar federations who believed they were studying the inner landscape of a single remarkable mind. He was also a vessel, and he had known it from the beginning, and he had never told anyone the full truth. Not Solon, not the assembly, not the physicians who monitored his declining health with the anxious attention of a civilization protecting its most valuable cultural asset. He had let them believe. 47 years of prizes, of lectures, of standing at podiums while the conclave's cultural elite applauded work that had been placed inside him like cargo in a hold. 47 years of accepting credit for a transmission. He was not originating but only carrying. That was the guilt. Not that the words were not his, he could have lived with that, the way a musician lives with perfect pitch that arrived uninvited. The guilt was the deception. The daily, hourly, moment-by-moment act of standing in the light of a reputation built on someone else's architecture. The smile at the awards, the gracious acceptance speeches, the interviews in which he discussed his creative process with the sincere authority of a man who believed what he was saying, because the alternative, admitting that his creative process consisted of falling asleep and waking to find the work already done, was not something the galaxy was ready to hear. He had tried to stop. That was the cruelest part. He had tried to stop writing, and the weight had come anyway, and the words had come anyway. And when he refused to pick up the stylus, the words had found other channels: his speech, his gestures, the way he described a meal or a view or a memory in casual conversation. Colleagues would quote him back to himself, and he would hear the deep-water cadence underneath, the rhythm that was not his, and he would know that the thing at the border was still speaking through him and would not stop until it had said everything it intended to say. Year 40, 7 years before this morning, the night the conclave assembly had voted to redesignate the exclusion boundary. Torvan had been invited to address the assembly, an unprecedented honor for a civilian, an acknowledgement of his status as the foremost Velori authority on the Forbidden Zone. His work had shaped the way an entire civilization thought about the border. His poems had given language to the silence that surrounded human space. His essays had articulated the architecture of avoidance that the galaxy had built around that region, and in doing so, he had made the avoidance feel not like cowardice but like wisdom, like a civilization mature enough to recognize what it could not safely touch. The assembly chamber was a vast, domed hall carved from the bedrock of Valar Prime's oldest continent, its ceiling rising 40 meters above the delegates in a smooth, unbroken curve of black stone that absorbed sound the way the Forbidden Zone absorbed light. 1,100 delegates sat in tiered rows, their faces lit by the cold blue glow of the proceedings display. The speaker had introduced him with a formality that bordered on reverence, reading a list of his honors that took 3 minutes to complete. Torvald had stood at the central dais, his prepared remarks on the tablet in his hand. He had written the speech himself, his own words, deliberately, painstakingly, each sentence composed in the daylight hours when the Deepwater voice was quiet and his mind was, for those brief intervals, entirely his own. The speech was moderate, careful, diplomatic. It recommended no change to the existing exclusion designation. It praised the Assembly's historical wisdom. It said nothing that would disturb or challenge. He had opened his mouth to speak, and the wait had come. Not the nighttime wait, not the slow, heavy press of sleep and stolen words. This was immediate and total. A hand on his throat, a fist in his chest, a gravity that pulled the prepared words out of his mouth and replaced them with others, words he had never thought, in a cadence he had never chosen, carrying a meaning that made the prepared speech feel like a child's drawing next to an architectural blueprint. He had spoken for 41 minutes. He did not remember a single word. The assembly had listened in absolute silence, not the polite silence of attention but the rigid silence of 1,100 minds encountering something they did not have a category for. When he finished, no one applauded. No one moved. The speaker had stared at him from the elevated bench for a long time, her face expressionless in the way that Valori faces became expressionless when the emotion beneath was too large for the features to contain. She had called a recess. 3 hours later, the assembly had reconvened and voted unanimously to reaffirm the exclusion designation and to extend its boundary by 3 additional sectors. They had also voted to classify the full transcript of Torvald's address at the highest level of restricted access. No one who had been present in the chamber that day ever spoke publicly about what he had said. Torvald himself had listened to the recording once, alone in his quarters, with the door locked and the windows sealed, and the tablet set to record and encrypt so that no one else would hear his reaction. The voice on the recording was his. The language was Valori, but the thing speaking through his language was describing the Forbidden Zone from the inside, with the calm, specific authority of someone who lived there. Not a warning, not a threat, a description, a poet's rendering of a place that functioned as the galaxy's unconscious, a region of space that absorbed what civilizations could not face about themselves and held it, patiently, the way an ocean holds heat. The address described in precise detail the mechanism by which the Forbidden Zone reflected guilt, not punishment. Not attack, reflection. The zone showed any consciousness that entered it the totality of its unresolved grief, its buried crimes, its historical amnesia, and it showed them with such perfect fidelity that the consciousness could not dismiss what it saw as fiction or projection or error. The Corvesi scientist had described it in 11 words. Torvald's address had described it in 41 minutes, with the granular detail of a guidebook written by someone who had spent decades inside the mechanism. He had deleted the recording. Then he had sat in his chair for 6 hours, motionless, and thought about the survey mission 40 years earlier, when he had been 26 years old and had walked to the edge of the silence, and the silence had walked back inside him. Year 37. 10 years before this morning, the Tessic Compact's formal request. 3 years after his address to the Assembly, a delegation from the Tessic Compact had arrived at Valar Prime. They had come quietly, no diplomatic fanfare, no public schedule, no announcement through the transit authority's standard channels. A single transport, unmarked, carrying 4 individuals who presented themselves at the conclave's visitor gate with credentials that identified them as members of the Compact's Office of Strategic Assessment. Torvald had been summoned to meet them in a secured chamber 3 levels below the archive's main floor. The room was small, windowless, its walls lined with signal-dampening material that absorbed sound the way the Forbidden Zone absorbed cartographic ambition. The 4 Tessavans sat on one side of a polished stone table, tall, angular, their gray-blue skin stretched over cheekbones that caught the overhead light like the edges of surgical instruments. They did not introduce themselves by name. They did not make conversation. The senior delegate, a woman with a scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, old and silver, a trophy from a career that had involved decisions made in rooms like this one, had placed a data crystal on the table between them. "We have been studying your work, Scholar Dreth, not the literary analysis, not the cultural commentary, the work beneath the work." Torvald had not moved. The thing inside him had not stirred. "We have run your published texts through every cryptographic and pattern analysis system the Compact possesses. We have consulted 17 independent xenolinguistic research teams. We have compared your output against the known communication patterns of every species in the Galactic Transit Authority registry, and against the patterns of 11 species that are not registered because they no longer exist." She had paused. Her colleague sat motionless, the way Tessavan officers sit when they are in the presence of classified material, spine straight, hands flat on the table, faces composed into the precise neutrality that their training required for situations where emotional display might compromise operational security. "Your poems contain an embedded signal, not a code. Not an encryption. A signal, a secondary layer of meaning that operates below the literary content, transmitted through the rhythmic structure of the verse. We cannot read it, we cannot decipher it, but we can measure its effect. Every species that has been exposed to your work in its original velori, not the translations, the original shows a measurable shift in neurological response when encountering references to the exclusion zone. Not fear, not aversion, recognition. As if the poems are teaching the reader's nervous system to process information that it was previously unable to receive." The data crystal on the table glowed faintly, the Tessavan indicator that a device was recording. "We need to know the source, Scholar Dreth, not for military purposes, not for intelligence purposes, because the Compact has been monitoring the exclusion boundary for 400 years, and in the last 3 decades, specifically since your first collection was published, the boundary has changed. The energy readings along the perimeter have shifted, not in magnitude, in quality. The boundary is still there, the prohibition is still in effect, but the silence on the other side has acquired a different character. Our analysts describe it as expectant. As if something on the other side is aware that someone on this side is finally listening." Torvald had looked at the data crystal. He had looked at the 4 Tessavan with their surgical cheekbones and their operational neutrality, and their 400 years of monitoring a region of space they dared not enter. And the thing inside him, the deep-water voice that had not spoken through his mouth since the assembly address had stirred. "Not to speak, to listen. I am the source," Torvald had said, "and I am not the source. The poems are mine and they are not mine. The signal you have detected is real and I cannot tell you how to read it because I cannot read it myself. I am the medium, not the message. I am the paper the letter is written on." The senior delegate had studied him for a long time. Her scar caught the light as she tilted her head, a deliberate movement. The Tessavan equivalent of a nod that carries more weight than agreement. "Then the paper is the most strategically significant object in the known galaxy, Scholar Dreth, and the Compact would like to know what happens when the letter is finished." He had not answered because he had not known. That was 10 years ago. Now this morning he knew. The letter was finished. The last line had been written, And what happened was not what the compact had feared, not a weapon, not an ultimatum, not a fleet emerging from the silence. What happened was a poet setting down his stylus and feeling, for the first time in 47 years, the weight lift from his chest. Year 33. 14 years before the Assembly Address. The disappearance of the Corvessy expedition. This was the first time Torvald understood that the thing inside him was not passive. It was not simply depositing words in his sleeping mind, the way a river deposits silt on a bank. It was aware of the world around him. It was listening through his ears, seeing through his eyes, reading the news feeds and the diplomatic dispatches, and the cultural commentary that flowed through Valori public life the way weather flows through atmosphere. The Corvessy were a young species, spacefaring for barely 3 centuries, expanding outward along the galactic arm with the reckless confidence of a civilization that had never encountered anything it could not disassemble and study. They had announced a scientific expedition to the border of the exclusion zone. 9 research vessels, the finest sensor arrays their technology could produce, crewed by physicists and xenobiologists and cartographers, who believed that the Forbidden Zone was simply a region of space that older civilizations had lacked the instruments to understand. The Valori conclave had issued a formal objection. The Dremery had issued a formal objection. The Tessic Compact, the Grathar Federation, the remnants of the old Ketharan League 14 species had sent diplomatic protests through the Galactic Transit Authority. The Corvessy had listened to all of them with the patient condescension of a species that believed its instruments were better than everyone else's fear. They had launched the expedition on schedule. Torvald had been at his desk when the news reached the Valori feeds. He had been writing, the deep-water voice composing through him a poem about a lake, a still, black lake on a world with no wind, where the surface was so perfectly calm that it reflected not the sky above but the interior landscape of whoever looked into it. The poem described what the lake showed, not your face, not your history, but the single thing you had done that you could not forgive, the thing you carried. The weight that shaped your posture and your choices, and the particular quality of silence you projected when you thought no one was observing. When the newsfeed chimed with the Corvessy departure announcement, Torvald's hand had stopped moving. The stylus had hovered over the tablet for 3 seconds, he counted later, when he replayed the moment in memory, and then it had written a single line that made the skin along his spine contract. They will learn what the lake shows. He had stared at the line. In 33 years, the thing inside him had never acknowledged the outside world. It had never responded to a current event, a conversation, a question. It had written its poems and essays with the self-contained absorption of a consciousness that existed on a different timescale, a consciousness for which individual years and individual species were details too small to register. But now it had looked up, and it had seen the Corvessy fleet, and it had written 6 words about them with the flat certainty of a coroner recording a time of death. The Corvessy expedition crossed the exclusion boundary 11 days later. 9 research vessels maintained telemetry contact with Corvessy mission control for 62 hours. The data was standard: spatial readings, energy density measurements, gravitational mapping. The scientists reported mild disorientation and vivid dreams, but nothing that fell outside normal parameters for long-duration spaceflight in unfamiliar space. On hour 63, the data changed. The same volume of information was still flowing, the same transmission intervals, the same frequencies, but the content shifted. The spatial readings were no longer measuring the space around the ships. They were measuring the space inside the crew. Neurological patterns rendered as coordinate grids. Memory architectures mapped as topographical elevations. Emotional states translated into gravitational constants, guilt registering as density, grief as curvature, regret as the precise angle at which light bends around a mass it cannot escape. The instruments had not malfunctioned. They were working perfectly. The space itself had changed what they were calibrated to measure. Corvesi Mission Control had spent 14 hours attempting to interpret the data. 14 hours of increasingly frantic recalibration, of engineers shouting across control rooms, of physicists staring at readouts that described the emotional weight of individual memories with the precision of a navigational beacon. They had brought in linguists, psychologists, philosophers, anyone who might recognize the shape of what the instruments were now reporting. No one could. The data was perfectly clear and perfectly incomprehensible, the way a mirror is perfectly clear and perfectly unable to show you anything except yourself. On hour 77, the final transmission arrived, not data. A single audio file, broadcast on an open frequency, in the voice of the expedition's lead scientist, a Corvesi xenobiologist named Tessivan, whose published work on exoplanetary ecosystems had won the Corvesi Science Medal twice, and whose reputation for calm, methodical analysis was the reason the expedition had been approved over the objections of 14 species. The audio was 44 seconds long. In it, Tessivan was weeping, not the sharp weeping of fear or pain, but the deep, tectonic weeping of a being whose foundational understanding of itself had been dismantled, the way a building is dismantled when the ground beneath it liquefies. Through the weeping, he spoke one sentence. It showed us ourselves, and we cannot bear it. The 9 ships vanished. No wreckage, no distress beacons, no bodies drifting in the void. The Corvesi sent a recovery fleet to the boundary, 12 warships crewed by their finest naval officers, and the recovery fleet stopped 3 sectors short of the exclusion line and turned back. No explanation was given. No official report was filed. The fleet commander resigned his commission within a week, citing personal reasons that the Corvesi military classified at the highest level. Within 2 generations, the Corvesi became one of the most insular species in the known galaxy. Their borders contracted by 40%. Their deep space exploration program was disbanded. Their diplomatic representation at the Transit Authority was reduced to a single attaché who attended sessions but never spoke. A civilization that had expanded outward with reckless ambition now pulled inward with equal force, as if something at their center had collapsed like a star going dark. They had not sent another ship toward the exclusion boundary. No one had. Torvan wrote a cycle of 12 poems about the Corvesi in the weeks after their disappearance. The cycle was called The Mirror's Depth, and it was published to immediate critical acclaim and deep, persistent unease. Critics praised its emotional architecture, its evocation of civilizational grief, its precise rendering of what it means for a species to encounter a truth about itself that it cannot survive in its current form. None of the critics noticed what Solon Mach would have noticed. She had retired by then, but Torvan thought of her every time he read a review. He thought of the way she would have held the manuscript up to the light, turned it in her dense, gray hands, and pointed with one thick finger to the exact line where the cadence shifted, where the poem stopped being a Valori writer's composition and became something else's thought rendered in Valori clothing. She would have found it on the first reading. She always had. He had tried to contact her twice after her retirement. The first time, 3 years after she left, he had sent a message through the conclave's internal communication system requesting a private meeting. The reply came from her assistant, a terse, formal note explaining that Archivist Mach was not accepting professional correspondence. The second time, 11 years later, he had gone to her residence in the lower quarter of the capital, a modest apartment block favored by Gravathi expatriates for its reinforced flooring and higher-than-standard gravity settings. He had stood at her door for 20 minutes before a neighbor, a Gravathi metallurgist who recognized him from his public appearances, told him that Solon had returned to her homeworld 8 years earlier and had not communicated with anyone on Valor Prime since. He had understood. She had not left because of what the poems were. She had left because of what his silence about the poems had made her an accomplice in a deception she had not consented to. 16 years of editing work that she believed was his, that she had shaped and challenged and refined with the full investment of her professional identity, and it had been something else's all along. Not entirely, not in the way she feared, but enough. Enough to make the partnership feel retroactively hollow, the way a bridge feels hollow when you learn the foundation was poured by someone other than the engineer whose name is on the plans. The guilt of Solon was a specific, localized pain inside the larger architecture of the guilt. It sat in his chest like a broken rib that had healed wrong, functional, ignorable most days, but sharp when he moved in certain directions, when he read reviews, when he accepted awards, when someone praised his ear for cadence and he thought of the woman who had first heard the wrongness and had the integrity to name it. The rhythm was in everything now, not a contamination, a saturation. His own voice had become the surface disturbance, the deep-water voice was the ocean floor. Year 26, 21 years before this morning. The day Torvald finally understood why the thing inside him had chosen a poet. He had been walking through the archives of the Conclave's cartographic division, a vast, climate-controlled vault beneath the Capitol, where the physical copies of every star chart the Velori had ever produced were stored in pressurized cases. Amber lamps lined the corridors between shelving units that rose 7 meters to the vaulted ceiling. The air carried the faint metallic scent of preservation chemicals and the dry, papery smell of mineral sheets that had not been handled in millennia. He knew the difference now between his own impulses and the things. After 26 years, the distinction was as clear as the difference between hunger and thirst. His own desires had a texture rough, uneven, tangled with the ordinary mess of want and uncertainty and self-doubt that characterized any living mind. The thing's impulses were smooth, frictionless. They arrived in his consciousness like stones dropped into still water, sudden, heavy, undeniable, generating no ripple of doubt because doubt was not part of their architecture. The thing wanted him to look at the charts. He pulled the cases from the deepest shelves, the oldest records, charts that predated the exclusion designation by centuries, drawn on treated mineral sheets in a script that had not been in common use for 6 millennia. The earliest Velori cartographers had mapped the galaxy with an obsessive precision that bordered on devotion, every star catalogued, every gravitational anomaly noted, every navigational hazard marked with a glyph that specified its nature, its magnitude, and the recommended avoidance margin. He found what the thing wanted him to find in the 7th case. A chart dated to the Velori Third Expansion period, roughly 4,000 years before present, showed the region of space that would later become the exclusion zone. But in this chart, the region was not blank. It was not marked with the do not glyph. It was mapped, fully, meticulously, with the detail that characterized Velori cartography at its peak. Every star, every planetary system, every energy reading. The chart showed a region of space that was inhabited. Not by the species the galaxy now avoided. The chart was 4,000 years old. Whatever had lived in that region then was not what lived there now, but the chart showed something else. In the margins, the narrow bands of space that Velori cartographers traditionally used for annotations, someone had written a note. The handwriting was different from the cartographers. Smaller, more deliberate, with a precision that suggested a consciousness accustomed to operating at scales where individual atoms mattered. The note was written in a language Torvald did not recognize on the surface. But underneath the unfamiliar script, in the rhythm and the structure and the specific way the characters related to each other, he recognized the deep-water voice immediately. It was the thing's language, written 4,000 years ago, in the margins of a Velori star chart by a hand that had been present before the silence began. The note said, "We were here before you learned to draw maps. We will be here after you forget how." Torvald stood in the amber-lit vault for a long time, holding the chart, feeling the weight settle into him, not the nighttime weight of stolen words, but a different weight, the weight of scale, of understanding what the thing inside him actually was. It was not an invader, it was not a parasite. It was not a weapon or a warning system or a monitoring device planted by the species behind the border. It was a voice, a consciousness that existed in the space beyond the boundary, that had existed there for longer than any civilization in the known galaxy had been recording history, and that had been looking for a way to speak to the rest of the galaxy for all of that time. It had not chosen a soldier. It had not chosen a diplomat or a scientist or a fleet commander or a politician. It had chosen a poet, a writer of domestic verse, a junior cultural liaison on a survey mission who had walked to the edge of the silence and instead of feeling fear, had felt the specific, unremarkable urge that poets feel, the urge to describe, to find the language for the thing that has no language yet, to stand at the edge of the unspeakable and say, I wonder what this sounds like as a stanza. The thing had heard that thought, and it had answered. Year 12, 35 years before this morning, the months after Solon Mach first confronted him about the fourth stanza. He had tried to stop. He had locked the tablet in a drawer, disconnected the writing interfaces, unplugged every recording device in his quarters. He had lain in his sleeping chamber with his hands flat at his sides and willed himself to be silent, to be empty, to be a vessel with its cargo doors welded shut. The words had come anyway. He had woken to find them written on the walls. Not carved, written, in the condensation of his own breath on the cold stone surfaces, in characters so precise they looked typeset. A full poem, 23 stanzas, rendered in moisture on rock, already beginning to evaporate in the morning air. He had scrambled for his tablet and transcribed it before it vanished, and even as he wrote he had recognized the contradiction. He was trying to stop carrying the words, and here he was on his hands and knees, desperately preserving them. The poem was about borders, not political borders, ontological borders, the boundaries between what a mind can hold and what it must refuse to see in order to remain functional. The poem argued with a compassion that Torvald found devastating, that brought tears to his eyes as he transcribed it, that every civilization builds its exclusion zone. Every species reaches a point where it encounters a truth about itself that it cannot integrate without transformation, and so it draws a line and agrees, collectively, without discussion, to stop looking in that direction. The truth does not go away. It sits behind the line, patient, unkillable, growing in the way that unacknowledged truths always grow slowly, in the dark, feeding on the energy of the denial that sustains them. The exclusion zone was not punishment. It was a cocoon. The galaxy had wrapped its unbearable truth in silence and called it forbidden, and the truth had waited inside the silence, growing, maturing, until someone would be ready to carry it back out. The poem argued that this was not failure. This was development, the equivalent of a young mind learning to repress trauma in order to survive a necessary mechanism that becomes, over time, a prison only when the mind outgrows the need for it and lacks the language to unlock the door. Torvald was the language. He had read the poem on his walls in the gray light of dawn, and he had wept. Not the weeping of fear or madness or self-pity, but the weeping of a man who has been carrying something heavy for 12 years and has finally been told, in terms he cannot deny, what it is and why it was given to him. He had picked up his stylus. He had opened a fresh file. He had never tried to stop again. Year 4, 43 years before this morning, the period when the poems first began to attract notice outside the conclave's literary circles. His first post-border collection, Cartographies of Silence, was a slim volume, 31 poems, each describing a different quality of the exclusion boundary as if it were a landscape rather than a political designation. The poems gave the silence texture, temperature, weather. They treated the forbidden zone as a place with moods and seasons, not metaphorically, but with the specific, grounded detail of a writer describing a place he had visited. The silence had weight in his poems. It had direction. It had the patient, gravitational pull of something that was not merely existing but attending. The Conclave's literary establishment received the collection with bewilderment and then with hunger. A reviewer for the Central Literary Feed had written, "Dreth writes about the forbidden zone the way a lover writes about an absent partner, with an intimacy that implies first-hand knowledge and a longing that implies the relationship is not over." In those early years, the thing inside him had been gentle. The deep-water rhythm was faint, a bass note under his own melody, easy to mistake for inspiration. The nighttime writings were short, a line, a couplet, a fragment he would find on his tablet in the morning and incorporate into whatever he was working on during the day. It felt collaborative. It felt like a gift. He had not felt like a vessel yet. He had felt like a poet who had been to an extraordinary place and brought something extraordinary back. The guilt had not started. The guilt required the understanding that would come later, the understanding that the collaboration was not between equals, that the deep-water voice was not a muse but a consciousness operating at a scale so vast that Torvald's entire species was, to it, a single syllable in a sentence still being composed. Year 1, 46 years before this morning, the survey mission. Torvald Dreth, 26 years old, junior cultural liaison aboard the Conclave survey vessel Ethon's Reach. A routine mission. Update navigational markers along the outer boundary of Velori jurisdiction. The kind of assignment given to junior staff because nothing was expected to happen, and the senior staff had better things to do. 9 days of marker updates. Tedious, procedural, uneventful. The crew of 43 moved through their routines with the glazed efficiency of professionals doing work they could perform in their sleep, and several of them did the night shift. Marker technicians were known to doze through the automated calibration sequences, waking only when the system chimed completion. Torvald spent most of those 9 days in the Cultural Observation Lounge, a small compartment near the stern that the Conclave mandated on every survey vessel, and that every survey crew treated as a storage closet with a viewport. He wrote poems. Small, careful poems about the quality of light at the edge of mapped space, about the way starfields looked different when you knew no one had named the stars. On the 10th day, a navigational error, a miscalibrated positioning array, the kind of minor technical failure that happens once in every 1,000 missions and usually results in nothing more than a course correction and a maintenance note in a file no one reads, carried the Ethon's Reach 3 sectors beyond its designated range, into the buffer zone that separated Velori jurisdiction from the exclusion perimeter. The bridge crew noticed almost immediately. The positioning data disagreed with itself. The inertial navigation system showed the ship where it should be, while the stellar reference array showed it somewhere else, somewhere the mission profile had explicitly excluded. The discrepancy was small enough to be a calibration drift and large enough to be a problem. Captain Resk, a career survey officer with no tolerance for ambiguity and less for the unexpected, ordered an immediate correction. The ship began to turn. Torvald was notified, along with all non-essential personnel, that a minor navigational adjustment was in progress and that there was no cause for concern. He had gone to the observation port on the lower deck. He had been composing a poem in his head, a small, domestic poem about the boredom of long-duration spaceflight, about the way the Velori word for emptiness contained, buried in its root structure, the old word for potential. He was thinking about line breaks, about the way a well-placed pause could transform a descriptive sentence into a question, about the specific consonant cluster in the Velori word for silence that forced the speaker to close their mouth completely before opening it again, creating a tiny, involuntary performance of the concept the word described. He had looked out the port and seen the boundary. There was nothing to see. That was the point. The boundary was not a wall or a line or a visible barrier. It was a change in the quality of the space itself, a thickening, a deepening, as if the void ahead had more dimensions than the void behind. The stars did not thin. They did not disappear. They continued exactly as they should, but they continued into something. The intervals between them were not empty. They were full of a presence that had no mass, no energy signature, no detectable property of any kind, but that was as real as gravity and as specific as a fingerprint. Torvald pressed his hand against the observation port, not as a gesture, as a reflex, the reflex of a poet encountering something that has no language yet and reaching toward it with the part of himself that makes language. The thing reached back. He felt it enter him the way water enters a sponge, not violently, not painfully, but with the simple physics of a substance filling a space that was shaped to receive it. It flowed into the structures of his mind that turned sensation into metaphor, metaphor into rhythm, rhythm into meaning. It settled into the architecture of language itself, the deep grammar that underlies all expression, and when it was done settling it rested, and Torvald Dreth stood at the observation port with his hand against the glass and understood, with a clarity that would take him decades to articulate, that he was no longer alone inside his own skull. The thing was not hostile. It was not curious in the way that smaller minds are curious, probing, testing, categorizing. It was patient. It had been waiting, not for him specifically, but for someone shaped the way he was shaped, someone whose primary function was translation. Someone who could take what it carried, meaning so vast and old and heavy that it had been sitting in the silence for millennia, unable to reach the minds on the other side of the border, and render it into words that those minds could survive hearing. Because that was the secret of the Forbidden Zone, not that it was dangerous, not that it destroyed ships or killed crews. The Forbidden Zone was a mirror. It reflected back, to any mind that entered it, the totality of that mind's unresolved burden. Every guilt, every grief, every memory buried under the survival mechanisms of conscious thought. The Corvusy had entered the mirror and shattered, because they had entered without preparation, without language, without the tools to metabolize what the mirror showed. The galaxy was not avoiding an enemy. It was avoiding itself. The collective, unprocessed guilt of 100 civilizations, reflected back by a region of space that functioned as the universe's conscience. And the thing inside the mirror, the deep-water voice, the consciousness now living inside Torvald, was not the mirror itself. It was the keeper, the archivist, the one who maintained the reflection and waited, with the patience of a geological process, for someone to come who could help the galaxy learn to look. The Ethon's reach had turned away from the boundary within minutes. Captain Resk had filed the navigational error, reprimanded the positioning technician, and set course for home. The crew had returned to their routines. No one had spoken about the buffer zone, because there was nothing official to speak about a calibration error, a course correction, a minor delay. The mission report mentioned the overshoot in a single paragraph, buried between a marker maintenance summary and a request for positioning array replacement parts. But Torvald had been different when they returned. Not visibly, the medical evaluation cleared him. The psychological screening found nothing abnormal. The debrief was routine. He spoke the same way. He ate the same meals. He reported to his desk at the cultural division the same way he always had. He just wrote differently. The first poem arrived 3 nights after their return. He had fallen asleep at his desk in the cultural division's shared workspace, a common enough occurrence for junior staff pulling extended shifts, and woken to find 4 stanzas on his tablet that he did not remember composing. The stanzas were about a door, not a literal door, a conceptual door, the threshold between knowing and not knowing, between the comfortable blindness of daily life and the terrifying clarity of seeing what is actually there. The poem described the door from both sides simultaneously, as if the poet were standing in the frame with 1 foot in each room, and it described the specific, physical sensation of being unable to close it. He had read the stanzas, and he had known, not understood, not deduced, but known, the way you know your own name, that the door the poem described was inside him, and that it would never close again. Year 0, the morning of the 47th year, this morning. Tor von Dreth sat at his desk in the conclave archive, 106 years old, dying by inches. The cracked tablet glowed in front of him. The line he had deleted upon waking was gone from the screen, but not from his memory. He remembered it the way you remember a dream that refuses to dissolve, that sits in the daylight like a stone that fell from somewhere above the sky. The line had been the last one. He knew this the way he knew his own heartbeat, not through analysis, but through the direct knowledge of a body that has carried something for so long that the carrying has become its primary function. The way a river knows when it reaches the sea. The thing inside him was finished. 47 years of poems, essays, cycles, testimonials, collected in 31 volumes. The complete work of Tor von Dreth, the poet of the border, the voice of the silence. 47 years of the deep-water consciousness speaking through a poet's grammar, translating the mirror's truth into language the galaxy could hold without shattering. The work was complete. The message had been delivered not as a threat, not as a warning, not as the cold, annihilating reflection that had destroyed the Corvusy, but as an offering, a vocabulary, a set of tools for looking into the mirror and surviving what you see. The guilt, the 47-year guilt of a poet who had accepted credit for a voice not his own, was dissolving. He could feel it leaving him the way the thing had entered him, slowly, without violence, with the simple physics of a substance finding its level. The guilt was dissolving because the thing inside him was, at last, explaining what it had known from the beginning and what Torvon had been too lost in his own shame to hear. The words had always been his. Not in the sense that he had originated them. In the sense that they could not have existed without him. The deep-water voice had no language of its own. It had meaning vast, ancient, patient meaning, but meaning without form is silence, and silence was what the galaxy had been hearing from the Forbidden Zone for 4,000 years. The thing had needed a poet the way a river needs a bed, not to create the water, but to give it shape and direction and the ability to reach the sea. Every line was a collaboration. The meaning came from the deep water. The language came from Torvon. The poems were not stolen. They were born, the way all poems are born, from the collision of something that needs to be said with a mind shaped to say it. He picked up the stylus. His hands were steady. The weight was gone, not lifted but transformed, the way grief transforms into memory when the carrying is complete. The thing inside him was quiet, settled, resting in the center of his mind the way it had rested for 47 years, but without the pressure now, without the urgency. A presence that he had long stopped thinking of as foreign. He wrote the last line again, the line he had deleted upon waking, the line that had frightened him because he had not recognized it as his own. It was his, it had always been his. The line read, "The silence was never empty, it was waiting for you to listen." He set the stylus down. Through the window, the binary dawn was fully risen, two small suns burning white and gold against the deep blue of the Velori sky. The city hummed its 11 billion voice chord. Somewhere in those spires, in those archives, in those academies and council chambers and private reading rooms, his words were doing their work, opening minds, teaching the act of looking, giving the galaxy the language it would need when it was finally ready to face the mirror. Tor von Dreth closed the tablet and sat in his chair, breathing the shallow, rattling breaths of a body that was nearly finished, and felt something he had not felt in 47 years. Peace. Not the peace of answers, the peace of completion, the peace of a man who has carried a weight for the length of a life and has set it down at last, not because the weight was wrong, but because the carrying is done. 16 years after Tor von Dreth's death, the Conclave's cartographic division published a revised atlas of the galactic arm. The atlas was, in most respects, identical to its predecessor. The same stars, the same systems, the same navigational hazards marked in the same precise Velori notation that had been the standard for 8 millennia. The exclusion designation was still in effect. The boundary was still drawn. The formal prohibition against crossing remained unchanged. But the blank space where the forbidden zone had been was no longer blank. In its place, the cartographers had printed a single line from Torvandreth's final collection. Not a poem, not a stanza. A single line, rendered in the old formal script, set into the margin of the chart the way the ancient mapmakers had once placed their annotations the way, 4,000 years earlier. Another hand had placed a note in a language the galaxy was only now beginning to understand. The silence was never empty. It was waiting for you to listen. Below it, in smaller type, the cartographers had added a classification note. It was the first new classification the exclusion zone had received since the designation was created. Status observed, nature reflective, threat assessment internal. The atlas was distributed to every navigation authority in Velori jurisdiction. It was translated into 18 languages and shared with 31 affiliated species. The Dremery received it and said nothing. The Tessic Compact received it and convened a closed-session review that lasted 9 days. The surviving Corvesi, the insular, contracted, silent Corvesi who had not communicated with the galactic community in 3 decades, received it and sent a diplomatic communication to the Velori conclave. The communication was 11 words long. We have read the atlas. We would like to speak. The forbidden zone remained forbidden. The boundary remained drawn. No ships crossed it. No expeditions were launched. The galaxy did not suddenly embrace the mirror it had spent millennia avoiding. But the nature of the avoidance changed. It was no longer the blind, reflexive recoil of a civilization that could not name what it feared. It was the careful, deliberate distance of a civilization that had been given the language to name it, and was now slowly, in its own time, with the patience the mirror had always shown, learning to say the word. The Velori had a term for this kind of distance, an old word, the one buried in the root structure of their language for emptiness. The word Torvan had been thinking about on the day the silence reached through the observation port and found, on the other side, a poet who was already reaching back. The word meant, not yet ready but no longer afraid to be. The atlas stayed open on desks across the galactic arm. The line from the dead poet glowed in the margins of charts that navigators consulted every day. And the silence beyond the border continued patient and vast, and full of everything the galaxy would one day be ready to hear. A poet had carried the weight had become the poem had become the map. And the map at last was complete.